Now, if you didn't know, I did want you to stand back from the speakers or however you listened, or take the wax out of your ears, because that was Metallica, and that was also somebody's already signed out. Okay, thank you very much. So see you Monday. Okay, you're lost, because we're talking about the life and death of Metallica's Cliff Burton. We're talking to my great friend Joe McIver again, who joins us live from his lead-lined, soundproofed ivory tower somewhere overlooking, I don't know, somewhere exotic. Joe, how are you, my friend?
Very well, thank you. If only I were actually on the top of Mount Fuji looking down and sort of onto my realm, instead of sitting in my house in High Wycombe near London. But there you go, you can't have it all.
You could have the realm of Low Wycombe, and that's probably, you never hear of Low or Middle Wycombe, so
you're getting lower all the time.
Exactly. Now listen, the thing is, Metallica have become this, everybody, Enter Sandman, you've got every sort of blonde guitarist doing a version of Nothing Else Matters. It's almost become an X Factor bleeding shoe-in. And they have become one of the biggest acts in the world. Massive tours, going on tour this time around as well, if they can stop either relapsing or shooting the wildlife. So therefore, people only think about them in those terms. But back in the day, i.e. pre-85, 86, Metallica were rough, they were young, and a lot of that was down to the bass playing and, I suppose, the leadership of one young man.
So Cliff Burton was a sort of an educated musician. That was the thing that civilians outside this wonderful music always fail to understand. Because the early Metallica sounded a bit like punk and it was a bit rebellious and the vocals were crap, I think people always thought it was about musicians who couldn't play. But Cliff was classically educated, by which I mean he had studied classical music and he'd studied music theory. So when he joined Metallica in 1983, he really sort of uplifted them from that sort of amateurish arena that they'd occupied before, and sort of gave their music a lot of sophistication. So I'm very glad you played For Whom the Bell Tolls before this, because that indicates there's a bass solo at the beginning of that song, which really indicates where he was going, even if it's not quite as complex as some of the other stuff. So yes, long answer to your question, mate, is that he was the sort of the voice of sophistication in the early Metallica.
Because if you think about the bass player, normally it's like 3 notes, there you go, and the lead guitarist is doing it. On Ritchie Blackmore's birthday, there can be no better exponent of twiddling away whilst wearing a hat with a feather in it, than Blackmore himself. But to actually use the bass almost and brace yourself, almost like the funk players are doing, i.e., bring the bass to the front, is an unknown concept in heavy rock, and this also, remember, it's early 80s. This is a new form of art. Thrash is only just kind of taking off from Motorhead, basically, isn't it? And the American bands.
You make a very good point. I mean, Cliff was very much from that sort of aggressive music background. He loved Discharge, the punk band, but really he was a huge fan as well of Geddy Lee of Rush. So he had his progressive music tastes there. And he loved Steve Harris of Iron Maiden. And as anyone who knows about Iron Maiden, Steve, the founder member and primary songwriter, is a lover of progressive rock, sort of like UFO and Uriah Heep and those bands that came before, rather like the Purple era you were talking about, Ritchie Blackmore. So all these very, very heavy, very fast, aggressive bands, quite a lot of them had a surprisingly sophisticated range of influences, and Cliff was definitely one of those.
What attracted him to Metallica then? Because obviously pre-Cliff, they were just another band.
It's funny you should say. It's a great, great question. I'm really not sure he was that attracted to them at all. But they had to basically beg him to join. And he, at first, was reluctant to do so because he lived in San Francisco, sort of very relaxed, middle-class neighborhood. They were from sort of the mean streets of Los Angeles and not doing very well at all, really, because their music didn't go down well among the sort of glam metal-loving audiences of the day. So they had to relocate. The three of them had to relocate to San Francisco. And if anyone listening to this show has ever driven between LA and San Fran, that's no little journey. That's a long old hike. So they really had to persuade him to join. And he'd been in a band beforehand that wasn't really going anywhere, called Trauma. So I think he was looking for something a bit better. But no one could have predicted in 1982, 1983 that Metallica were going to be the biggest metal band in the world. So it was just a big old fluke on everyone's account that they crossed paths and that they meshed so well together and that they ended up making 3 amazing records together. And it was only 3, unfortunately, but still, those records, they just stand up. An incredible catalogue. And, as we speak, we're one day into the release of a new Metallica album all these years later. So it's a great time to be talking about Metallica. They would not be the band they are now without him, even though he was only in the band for 3 years for the most tragic reasons.
But again, people who think that metal is just people dragging their amps around and their knuckles across the floor are sadly mistaken. There's a lot of musicianship in that. But also, it's interesting because again, if you think of Metallica, I mean, Anthrax are still out there doing it, and you've had experience with Anthrax. And in fact, I interviewed... Yeah, exactly. And they're still going, because I always say this, rock fans are unlike any other fans in the world. They stick with you. But it's an interesting point in the history of metal, because you've got the new wave of British metal, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard before they went totally Californian. And then you've got Motorhead doing their thing. And this is and I'm going to go high, Lemmy, because Motorhead, I think, has the influence on the early American bands like Metallica because of that sort of thrash, and Anthrax.
It was the attitude, really. Yeah, it was the attitude that they had, and
the lifestyle, but then you've got Van Halen who've done that Southern California, and Van Halen are a really tight band, and that's why they get so good, is because they're phenomenal live and they blow a UFO off the stage famously, and they'll be able to follow them, and yet. The thrash bands are not going down that big hair, Poison, Cinderella way that dominates, if you like, MTV to a certain extent, and your kids can play in the 80s. And but that underground, that live thing, which is Metallica in the early 80s.
Well, there was a bit of spandex in the thrash scene. I agree with what you're saying, but there was a little bit of a crossover. There are very early photographs of James wearing one leopard skin glove. How about that? When he was, I know. You don't really see them very often. And fair play to him. He's got a sense of humor about that stuff. But they very quickly upgraded their image. Even Slayer, who were much heavier and faster and scarier than Metallica ever were, they sort of dabbled a bit with the makeup thing, from time to time, not in a kind of a glam kind of way, in a kind of a spooky makeup sort of way. So it was just all, nowadays we have all these subgenres, don't we? We talk about thrash and death metal and power metal and black metal and so many subgenres of all those things. Back then, you just had metal. It was all metal. And if you had a band like Metallica did a band called Phantom Lord, then that was your black metal song, you know what I mean? Yeah. Even though it doesn't stand up, it's nothing like modern black metal, which is a genre of its own. It was a much simpler time. You're right when you say that there was this division between the sort of glamours and the thrashers, but there was a little bit of overlap. We all remember in the 80s considering wearing a bandana at one point or other and thinking better of it, hopefully.
Guilty, and if not, that was it.
Well, there was no social media back then, thank God.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's no images of the eras that people had. I went through a goth phase, and I can say this because now I'm 52, and this happened when I was 17. I had the long trench coat and the pointy shoes, but no one has any photos. I'm so pleased.
Did you have the felt boots with the studs on them?
No, I know the ones you mean, but no, not quite. But they were very pointy. Yeah. Mine's were patent leather. They're very, very pointy. How I survived, I don't know, because I grew up in rural Somerset. So it wasn't exactly the local pig farmer's garb of choice near me.
Well, yeah. My problem was, of course, I was a goth, and I came from and I came from Stoke-on-Trent to southern Spain. The reason that there are no goths in southern Spain is if you try wearing mascara and a long coat and boots in 90-degree heat in the shade,
not practical.
You're gonna die. I found out at a party, and my hairstyle went like that. Anyway, let's move on from that. those. Hey, gosh, I was only talking about that the other day, trying to explain goth to somebody. Anyway. Where? I mean, Metallica have already got a deal when Cliff joins them. I mean, they're already putting music out, or what's the situation?
Yes, they were signed to. Well, let me think. He was there when they signed their deal with Megaforce in New York, and they made this journey. This famous journey across America from California to New York. They'd never been there before. They drove themselves there, nearly died a whole ton of times. And that journey is primarily notable because that was when they decided to dump Dave Mustaine, their guitar player, who I've met so many times, done a lot of stuff with his band. He's always been really cool to me. But at the time, it's kind of known that he was a bit of a bad drunk. You didn't want to be around him after he'd had a few beers. And I think Metallica just had enough of this and got rid of him. So Cliff was there, and he was the one that informed Anthrax, actually, with whom they were sharing a rehearsal room in New York, that Mustaine was going, and that this new guy from Exodus called Kirk Hammett was flying in the same day. And it must have been a very exciting time. I was too young for this. I was only 10 when they recorded their first album in New York.
And in Somerset for a start, yeah.
The links between my life and theirs are tenuous.
Uncanny, I tell you. You got the vibes. You were sitting there overlooking the rolling hills. Yeah, all right.
Precisely, and looking at the manure stacked up in the corner of the field. No, it wasn't quite New York or LA for that matter. So this record got done, and Cliff, on the first record, Kill 'Em All, did the most amazing thing. He was either given or insisted on taking a 5-minute bass solo. Called Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth. And I honestly cannot think of a bass solo on a thrash metal album, until you had the technical thrash metal bands a bit later. Anyway.
But this could have gone totally tap. This could have been Derek Smalls, the Derek Gubbins, in the Jazz Odyssey, and then go and the audience could have gone, right, we're off to the bar when you come back to us when you start doing double drum beats. So, but people got it.
They did get it. He was headbanging like a demon while he was doing this. He was quite a sight on stage, Cliff. No one like this had really been seen before playing bass and doing this stuff. And in fairness, it was a really good solo. It sounds boring to say that it was made up of sort of classical elements, but it's actually quite watchable. And he'd honed it over a period of years. And the rest of the show was so aggressive that actually it was quite a nice little break. You can see all this on YouTube. And in subsequent years, their bass players, I think it's fair to say, have not quite had the dominant personality within the band that Cliff had. So you won't see any 5-minute bass solos these days. I wish they'd do it though. It's great to see. But as a bass player, I say that.
Do you think it is that when somebody who's a decent standard or a better standard than you are joins a band, you're a bass player yourself. I've been known to fall backwards off stage. So therefore, but you try and up your game because you don't want to be the guy unless you're the drummer because everybody looks at the drummer. Normally people look at when you hit a bum note, you always look at the bass player. If the bass player is better than you, that's a conundrum. So you can perhaps look at the drummer because you can't look at the bass player because he's better than you. And the drummer, if he's doing a thrash drum, he's doing, double, exactly. So
whatever. Yeah,
exactly. So did it make them, obviously discipline them, up their game? I mean, if they threw somebody out for being drunk, they weren't exactly being, I don't know, Motley Crue on a Whit Sunday.
No, it's interesting you say that. So Cliff educated them musically, specifically James, who has become one of the world's great guitar players, very, very talented. At the time, needed a bit of tuition, I think, and he got that from Cliff, who had studied musical harmony and theory. And it's not that Metallica completely vanished up themselves and became Rush, but by the time you get to the third and fourth album, you have these quite complex arranged out parts. And Cliff had a lot to do with that. But that said, they all moved incredibly quickly. You listen to the first album, Lars is really not doing a very good job. And against all received wisdom, Lars became a pretty damn decent drummer by the time they went to their third and fourth record. The poor guy. We're diverging from the subject here, but I interviewed him a few years ago.
Friday, but yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed him, I don't know, it must be 10 years ago now, and said, look, Lars, a lot of people were giving you a lot of grief over the years for not being a good enough drummer. Did that ever bother you? And he said, it used to, actually. So between Puppets and Justice for All, he got a load of lessons, right? He was trying to expand his techniques and become more innovative and inventive, I should say, as a drummer. And then when the Black Album came along, which may be beyond the remit of this conversation because Cliff was long gone by then it all went down to simple grooves that sold millions of copies and off they went, a completely different kind of Metallica. But no, the Cliff definitely had a huge musical impact, and also his personality. He was a bit older than them. They'd had to force him to persuade him to join the band. And he, what he said went. If a decision was made and he didn't like it, it wouldn't happen. Once he was gone, that dynamic completely changed. And then Metallica became the Lars and James show, with Kirk along as in a supportive role, and then whichever bass player there was in an even more supportive role. Bless their hearts. I've met Jason Newsted and Robert Trujillo many, many times, and they're the best people. But they are very much in the role of an employee, I think.
So it's 1986 and they're on tour because, rock bands live by bringing the tribes together. And there's nothing better than a live rock show. And obviously Metallica at that point are brilliant. And it's, how far into the tour were they before they went to Sweden, isn't it? Where everything goes.
Yeah, they just played the first few dates. They played a gig in London just before, and they were heading. If you know the layout, they were coming. Sorry, they'd been in Sweden the day before, and they were coming down Sweden, as it were, towards Copenhagen, where Lars's family lived, coincidentally. And what happened was, it's funny enough that the bus crashed in the early hours of September the 27th, 1986. And nowadays there is a museum at the crash site. And in fact, I went there last year for its opening event, and I would urge all of your listeners, if they get the chance to get up to mid-Sweden, to make the effort and do. You fly to Copenhagen and drive 2 hours and you're there. And it's basically set near to the corner of the road where the bus crashed. And what happened was, the British bus, run by a company called Lenwright Travel, which I don't think is still extant. The driver's never been identified, and people like me have really tried very hard to find out his identity. And what happened was they were making a sort of a slow left turn. And for whatever reason, this is about 6 a.m. in the morning, the bus drifted off to the road, to the right slightly, because they're driving on the right, it being Sweden. Well, Europe. Well, not Britain. And because the right-hand wheels of the bus were off the road on gravel, that spun the bus around. When the bus had finished turning around, it flipped over on its side. And that, there wouldn't have been a problem necessarily, except what had happened was that Cliff was sleeping in a bunk by a window, which was uncomfortable. And and this is a true story, and I know this because I asked Kirk Hammett to confirm it. He had been allocated that bunk because he lost a bet with Kirk. They had cut a pack of cards to determine who went in this fateful bunk, and Kirk pulled the ace of spades. I swear this is true. I thought this was just rock and roll nonsense, but Kirk confirmed it, winning it. So Cliff went to this particular bunk, and as the bus fell, he fell towards the window, broke through the window and hit the ground, and then the bus fell on him, and crushed him to death. And once the dust had settled, so to speak, and the emergency services had been, the driver was arrested, not because they suspected anything, but because in that situation, the driver is automatically arrested in that country, but was let go a couple of days later, having what's the word, crime or error or mistake having been found. And, theories have abounded since then that there was black ice, but the weather reports for that day in September that year indicate that it wasn't that cold. James certainly went up and down looking for ice. He at the moment of the crash, he was furious because the driver was talking about black ice. It's just one of those great conundrums that has never really been solved. For whatever reason, the bus flipped over through incredibly bad luck and probably through very flimsy design, and the way the bus had been converted to a tour bus, so on a budget. Bands back then didn't have the luxurious tour buses that now exist, and Cliff just died at the age of 24. And I remember, so we're talking here, aren't we, about the book I did about Cliff, which is coming into its 3rd edition. For that book, I interviewed Cliff's girlfriend at the time, and obviously she received a phone call from Sweden, or from the management, rather, Metallica's management, and all these people who'd been in love with Metallica and in love with Cliff's playing had to be informed that this had happened. And interviewing many of those people for this book was awful. Even all these years later, there were a lot of tears, a lot of unresolved sadness, and no closure really for anyone. And Cliff's family, I mean, Ray, his father, became a spokesman in later years for Metallica. He only died a couple of years ago in his 90s. And they had already lost another son, Cliff's older brother, who died when Cliff was young. And so to lose a second boy, I don't know how any family gets over that. I don't know if you're a dad, but the thought of that just haunts me, anything like that happening. So it's just this incredibly terrible event. Metallica recovered and just bounced back with a lot of mental damage that wasn't resolved for years to come. And they resumed their careers. But in terms of Cliff's circle of friends and family, I don't think they ever got over it.
Because, that was my thing. How does a band, because a band, especially touring, I mean, it's not family, but it becomes family, and you're living in each other's pockets, left, right, and centre. And with somebody,
what I would say is that if you put in all that work, right, and they were 4 or 5 years now into their careers, 3 years into their careers as a signed band, you probably wouldn't call it a day and throw it away. And they said, we think Cliff would have wanted us to continue, and that's absolutely true. It is true. He would have done. He wouldn't have wanted them to call it a day after that. Bands do fold when a key member dies. Look at Led Zeppelin. But the fact is they were able to replace their bass player within a matter of 6 weeks or something like that and go on tour to Japan where they were expected. I think they did the right thing because they were young and stupid, like everyone is at that age. They drank through their sorrow rather than dealing with it in any sort of, sophisticated way. Somehow they kept it together and kept it going.
And they become, as we said, the juggernaut that they are now. I mean, they're playing...
Yeah, within about 5 years, I think. Yeah, probably by 92, 93, when they were doing that massive Black Album tour. That was when, if not the millions, then the hundreds of thousands started rolling in, and the music changed, and the whole environment changed. I mean, someday I'm going to do a book about 1991, which I think is a bit of a year zero for metal, because you had Nirvana and you had the Chili Peppers and you had the start of grunge and you had the Black Album, which changed everything, blew away all the sort of, all the fun spandex stuff that we never admitted loving, but we all did, in the 80s. But that was 5 years later, and they were a completely different beast, But those early albums, I think a lot of people think they're the best. I would tend to agree. The 80s and arguably the Black Album too, that's where Metallica peaked for me creatively. And so much of that is down to Cliff.
So what do you hope that people will discover? I mean, that they learn more than, because, as I said before, people, you say Metallica, there we go, Black Album, nothing else matters, Enter Sandman. And okay, they might get Master of Puppets, but, and it's just is it like one of those what if, so that people know? I mean, because there's always a point to your writing, Joe. You don't just dash one off as a corporate, money spinner, do you?
No, there was a function. There was a higher purpose to this book, pretentious as that sounds. When someone dies in tragic circumstances, you can only do one thing for that, one thing, and that is ensure that their memory is understood correctly and respected. Now, I never met Cliff. I was only 15 when he died. But the gift of the music that he gave us is enduring, and it will be for a very, very long time. Now, when someone gives you that gift, the least you can do is ensure that their life, brief though it was, is celebrated and understood correctly in context. Because what these books do, and again, this sounds a bit pretentious, is commit the history of our culture for posterity, for future historians, in hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years. Who knows? These books are going to endure in digital form long after we are gone. Then people will understand what these people did for us. And that, I think, is a higher function that deserves to be done. And it's a great story. It's a funny story. It's a sad story, but that's really its higher function. And that's what I try to do.
Here's a question for you, just quickly, and I'll let you go because I know, because it's Friday. But when you're writing a story like this, or, putting this down for posterity, and you know how it ends, how hard is it to write it in the moment as if you don't know what's going to happen in Sweden? Because it would be very easy for you to go, and then he did this, and we have Saint Cliff,
Yeah, no, and again, it's a great question, because it's very easy to sanctify these people and put them on a pedestal, and no one deserves to be a saint, really. So that's not serving the purpose, really. What you try and do is tell the real story, and the way to do that is to get hold of the people who were really there and really knew the guy and really understood him. So otherwise, you're not doing your job as a journalist, really. That's what this is. It's a book, but it's a work of professional journalism and fact finding. So what you do about knowing that there's going to be an ending is you make sure you do it objectively. You don't load it with soupy emotions unless you have to. The story is sad enough as it is, right? You don't need to turn it into a soap opera. So you try and keep a sober, objective view, easy as it would be to be subjective, and make it a very emotional thing. it's sad enough, man. It doesn't need to be made sadder by someone like me. It's a horrendous tragedy that this talent was taken from us at the age of 24. So I don't need to to sort of overdo that and make it even sadder than it is. So the answer is to try and stay objective and try and stay professional. I think that's the answer.
The book is To Live Is To Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton. It's by Joel McIver, who we speak to today. Joel, if people want to follow you online and see what you're up to, socials, website? No
website anymore. All I do is Facebook. I am on Twitter and Instagram, but I never use them. Yeah, so it's just Joel McIver on Facebook. I answer all messages, even the nasty ones.
Even the nasty ones. That's very manful of you.
There are no nasty ones. It's all right. Everyone's very nice.
Community, for goodness sake. Come on. And also the book, if you wish to download the book, all proceeds will go to Joel, don't worry. You can get it via the virtual bookstore. I want to hear about this 91 book, because I'm with you on this one. You know, when they finally shot down with their flaming hairspray, Cinderella, Nelson, all that lot, White Snake, David Coverdale's White Snake finally imploded as well, and that wave that came in and absolutely took them by storm.
Do you know, it's an absolute game-changing year, and you could argue reasonably that several years are like that. But I remember very clearly living through that. I was 20 and 91, and I remember watching that Nirvana video, and I remember thinking about Bon Jovi and Motley Crue in comparison to how sort of keen and not futuristic, but of the future that Nirvana looked. Yeah. And I thought, there's something going on here. And it's only, and here we are, 30 years later? Oh my God, 32 years later. Yeah. And I think that story needs to be told. So hopefully one day I'll tell it.
I remember the Sunday Times doing an article saying, Guns N' Roses are the most dangerous band in the world, okay? And then Nirvana rocked up, and I just went, okay. End of.
Next. No, precisely.
The book is called To Live Is To Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton. We will get you back on when you have written that tome about 91. This is by Joe.
Looking forward to that.
Go forth and follow Joe. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on. It's wonderful to see you.